I do want to continue in our altars series. We've been looking at Old Testament altars that were built. Then obviously, oftentimes it was something where, God had done something significant, or the people just felt led, in that moment that this would be a good place to build an altar. These altars were kind of recognition of something God had done, a significant time that God had moved, and so they built an altar so that for generations to come, anytime you would walk by that altar, you would say, oh yes, like this is the place that God did this for his people. Altars for us are really places where, we meet with God. Maybe you have a place in your home, Tammy and I always have had, just a place that's really for talking with God and meeting with him. It's just a special spot that we have, and it is so helpful. If you have never thought about this, or if you have opportunity to maybe have or create something like this, it's that chance. Sounds like God's calling you right now. It's that chance to create a spot, and if there's something about it that when you go and you sit there, you're like, oh yes, like I was just talking with God about this yesterday. Like, it can be so much easier to like pick up a conversation and, really have a time that we meet with God. And so also, we just got these new altars here at church. And so we realize, I hope that through this series, that there are a variety of reasons that we come, to the altar. Years ago, it was maybe primarily to, confess sin. But we realize in the Bible, like there are, in fact, today is going to give us even a few more, the reasons why churches have altars, why we would even have space for people to pray and to meet with God. And so what has happened is, in looking at these altars, at least in the ones that I have, is that there's also often Old Testament and New Testament significance to it. And so with that, we're going to look at the altar that is built at the place called Bethel. Now, there is a large church that's in California named Bethel, and what I have to say this morning has nothing to do with that. And so just so you know that, they merely borrow the name, which Bethel means what? Anybody know? House of God. Yeah, kind of like God's dwelling place. Isn't that a special definition for an altar, right? And so if you remember, we've kind of looked at some of the instructions that God gave about altars and how they were to be built from Exodus 20. We then looked at Cain and Abel and how they brought different offerings, right? Where Abel had brought a first fruits, like a high priority, the best of the best is what he brought in offering. Cain brought some stuff, and God says, no, when you come to God and look to give him the best, like give him the most excellent offering that you can, when you come. Don't give God leftovers. Like he sees all, he knows all, and so give him your best. And then last week we looked at Shechem, which is often pronounced Shechem, and some of the things that happened there. And that is that, that was a place that sometimes they struggled with idol worship and then with the Lord. But it's also that place of commitment, right? Where Joshua, standing upon the idols that Jacob had buried, he says, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And so oftentimes we come to the altar, and that might be the heart of our prayer. Like, God, like I know this is hard, but as for me and my house, we will serve you. We will look to you. We will worship you. Even though there might be, our neighbors don't, or others don't, or co-workers don't. But God, we want you to be the Lord of our house. Would you help us to understand that and live that and move forward in that way? And so this brings us to Bethel. Genesis 12:8, just moving on a few verses from where we were last week, it says, "From there he went on toward the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord." Now, what's very interesting from this particular text is that the Hebrew people from here on out, or for years, for a few generations after, that this was very significant to them, this place, Bethel, that was considered a house of God, and then Ai, which is on the east. So if you think about it, in the Old Testament, right, probably, well, I shouldn't say that. In the Old Testament, they don't have, as we do in the New Testament, like the most common application that we have in the New Testament is we see the gospel there, and we receive the gospel, we believe it, and it starts this new life for us that is in God. And so, therefore, so many of us have this idea that we have a life by which we made that commitment, and a life that was in God or in Christ or as a child of God, but then we have a past by which we weren't. We were apart from God. We weren't with Him, right? And so we have that distinction. Well, that distinction in the Old Testament, when they got there, was the story of passing through the water, right? And so when God brought them to the water and then split the water under Moses, and then they walked through. And so many of them, thought about that in their relationship with God, that, I remember the time that God saved me, became real to me, like helped me to pass through this water, did this miraculous thing in my life. And so they would think about that in the context of their faith, is that they would say, we see that was the time that God saved me, like God made a difference in my life. And so a before and after kind of experience, they thought often about the waters that parted for their illustration. Well, this illustration of Bethel and Ai are kind of the illustration they had prior to that. Bethel was house of God, purposes of God, like having God in my life, and Ai always represented the past, or the space that was far from God. It's interesting because after this point we can see is that in the Bible is that you see some of them just think in this way that this is real. Like I can either be focused on Bethel, the house of God, and that altar, God's purposes in my life, or the land of Ai, which represents the past, my past. And I'm always trying to move away from Ai and towards Bethel, towards the house of God. I mean, you think about even today, right? Like that's some of things for us is that we have possibly a pull from our past. And we have the ways that we dealt with things in the past, the ways that we dealt and coped with things in the past. And we see the spiritual journey as God giving us this opportunity to not do things in the same way we did in the past, but rather we look to God and we come to His house and we think of this place called Bethel that is not our past, but is our way forward, and now we conduct ourselves in the way that God wants us to conduct ourselves. Well, then Abram goes to Egypt. And what happens after he moves out from Bethel and goes to Egypt, he gets filled with this insecurity. Really, a real difficulty for him, in that he is very concerned that Pharaoh is going to look favorably upon Sarai, his wife. And he goes, man, like if we come into Egypt here and Pharaoh looks upon us and sees me and my beautiful wife he's going to do away with me and take her. And so what Abram does in this insecurity, he comes up with this idea. He says, I'll let him know that she is my sister. Which, of course, what? Is not the truth. And out of this insecurity, believes that this deception of Pharaoh would help him. And, of course, it doesn't. Right? Pharaoh ends up taking Sarai as his wife because they're brother and sister. And then, all of a sudden, that brings all kinds of trouble upon Pharaoh, right? And so what does Pharaoh say? Pharaoh goes, well, why'd you do that? Why'd you do that to me? Why didn't you speak the truth and live out the truth? And so then, after they have this interaction, it says in Genesis 3 and 4, from the Negev, it should be 13, I believe. From the Negev, he went from place to place until they came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. And Abram called on the name of the Lord. And so Bethel's this beautiful place where he meets with the Lord and builds this altar, and then goes into Egypt and messes up really bad. And what does he do? He comes back to Bethel. Abram realizes, oh man, I just really messed up. And so he returns to the altar where he was before Egypt. He comes right to that place. And this is most likely the place where he just reaches out to the Lord and says, Lord, I'm going to try to follow you, but here I really messed up. And so Bethel becomes this beautiful place of second chances, where Abram is seeking a do-over, saying, God, I'm trying to follow you, but here I really messed up, and I'm asking if I can begin again. And so for years in the church, the altar has been that place where we have received second chances from God. I don't know about you, but maybe some of you have needed like a third chance or a fourth chance too, right? And yet, the altars that we have are the places where we come. And we can just express to God, like, I messed up here, I sinned here, I am confessing this to you, and I'm asking at this altar, you and I might be able to begin again. Well then, Jacob again comes to this place of Bethel. Isn't it interesting how there's these parallels between Abraham, and Jacob's life? And so you have this very precious interaction that happens in Genesis 28, where it says this: Jacob left Beersheba and he went out to Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairwell resting on the earth, with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. Verse 13. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are laying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Doesn't it sound familiar? I am with you, and I will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to the land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, Bethel, I was not aware of it. He was afraid and he said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and he set it up as an altar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. When Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I'm taking, will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. And this stone that I've set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I give you a tenth. Wow. And so for Jacob, Bethel becomes a very significant place. Why is that? Why has it become this altar place to him, this very special house of God, gate of heaven? Well, for one thing is, we see here that God comes to Jacob in Bethel, and without going, deeply into what he's seeing, let's put it this way succinctly for us this morning, is that God showed him at Bethel the activity of heaven. He gives him sight into what is taking place partially in the heavenly realms. I will tell you that when you build an altar and when you consistently come to the Lord and you keep coming to him in prayer, don't be surprised if some of what he shows you is the activity of heaven, the significance of what is happening in the spiritual realm and its impact on the physical realm. It begins to change your prayer life. That as God reveals more of him and his activity, right? He does this so that we can press in prayer. The other is that Bethel for Jacob becomes again that place where God restates his promises. So Bethel becomes a place where God shows him the activity of heaven, but then gives him again the outline of his promises. That your family is going to be significant, has great purposes in the things of God that is to come and is going to be numerous. And so Jacob always thought of Bethel in this place where God revealed more of himself and his activity to him, and also where God had again stated his promise. And so it's not surprising that Jacob responds in this way, right? He says, Lord, now that you've shown me these things, and as I journey through, you keep on providing all of my needs, I want you to know, right, that you will be my God. And then he also commits that he gives a tenth, which is really interesting because you don't have the whole sacrificial system set up yet, but this is what Jacob says, like Lord, in response to what you've shown me, in response to what you've given me, this is what I'm going to do. And so Bethel becomes a very special place to Jacob. And I pray that as we meet with God, that these are some of the things that he might do in our life that keep us coming back to him. Because at the altar is where we get a glimpse of what God is really doing and what he's up to. And when we come to the altar, we also get that opportunity for him to speak his promises, remind us of his promises in our life. The other thing about Bethel is that it was known for prophecy. It had a school of prophets. It has a community of prophets. And Deborah, the prophetess, was there. And so we see an instance of this in 2 Kings 2, 1 through 3. When the Lord was about to take Elijah up to heaven in a whirlwind, Elijah and Elisha were on their way to Gilgal. Elijah said to Elisha, "Stay here, the Lord has sent me to Bethel." But Elisha said, "As surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you." So they went down to Bethel. The company of the prophets at Bethel came out to Elisha and asked, "Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today?" Wow. Right? And so they significantly feel called to Bethel. And here, Bethel has a group, the company of prophets, a group that is on the same page with God, understands the things of God, and so therefore speak them as they have opportunity. So I believe trying to come alongside Elisha, give him a bit of awareness, warning, do you know what is about to take place in your life? And so the Lord leads them in doing that. I think that as a church communes with God and keeps interacting with God, is that He often builds prophecy in a church. Now, before you think I'm going off some kind of theological deep end or something like that, or what are you talking about? Are we going to start, predicting the future for each other? What are we doing? What's going on here? No, if you look in 1 Corinthians 14, 1 through 3, this is what I think and what comes to my mind when I think of prophecy. It says, "Follow the way of love and eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to people but to God. Indeed, no one understands them. They utter the mysteries by the Spirit. But the one who prophesies speaks to people for their what? Strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. Anyone who speaks in a tongue edifies themselves, but the one who prophesies edifies the church." You see, I think a community of prophecy is a beautiful way to define a church. And if I can speak this over you even this morning, may you become a community of prophets. What I mean by that is that you hear from the Lord and then you speak words of strengthening, encouragement, and comfort to one another. And you don't hold back. Right? I mean, what do we know about the language in the church? We know that there's some pretty destructive language. There can be, right? There can be grumbling and complaining. The Israelites did a lot of that. And that can happen sometimes. And unfortunately can spread like a wildfire in the church. We know that sometimes, churches have struggled with gossip, where they're kind of talking to each other about each other. And it's really not that great. For whatever reason, that happens. But I think God's call is for a church to be a prophetic community. For us to go to Him and to talk to God. And when He gives us an encouraging word for someone else, for us to share it. When He gives to us a strengthening word for someone else, for us to share it. When He gives us a word of comfort for someone else, for us to share it. Right? Isn't that the language we want to have in church? Right? That we would speak to each other in those kinds of ways, strengthening, encouraging, and comfort. I had someone actually just recently, and they actually came to me and they said, I'm kind of sarcastic with Jared. And sometimes, I like to kind of poke fun at people by putting them down. And he goes, but Jared doesn't get it. Jared's our son. I said, yeah. I said, because I always ask my boys to be prophetic, to always speak to others in ways that strengthen, encourage, and comfort. And so if they don't get your sarcasm, they don't get your digs, I apologize. Because that just isn't a language that we allowed in our house. And, isn't that good? That we might say, we're not going to allow that stuff in our house. But what we will allow is words of strength and encouragement and comfort. Especially as the Lord gives it, that's what happens, as you spend time with the Lord, right? Those are some of the things that He communicates to us. He doesn't, I'm just saying, like, that's what I've experienced, like, and that's what I've known, and maybe the Lord might just help us with that today. Well, then we come to a place close to Bethel in the ministry of Jesus. And that's found in John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51. It says, the next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We found the one whom Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Speaking of taking a dig, right? Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus says, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." And then he added, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." Isn't this beautiful? He says, "Nathanael, with that right heart, God is about to show you more. God's going to show you the activities of heaven. So keep pressing in." This is a small part of the promise that Jesus gives us, right, when it comes to the Holy Spirit. Because he says, because you don't understand, like, Jesus, like, we've got to do some really cool stuff. He didn't quite say it that way, but that's kind of my translation, But he says, but are you ready for the Holy Spirit to do even greater things? Right? You see, when we build altars in our life, we get to see God do the greater things. We get to see Him show us how He might blow us away. But we got to have the right heart, like Nathanael, with no deceit, but with a clean and pure heart. We keep on coming to God, pressing in on Him, and He shows us even greater things.